We don't have, yeah, we do, there we go.
Yeah. I think they're here.
We are good.
We'll start the meeting as soon as you turn on the cameras.
Mr. Chairman, we are live and ready to start.
Okay. All right. We'll open this extra Senate Mineral Committee meeting this morning. We now have a quorum. We have to do
Yep.
that first?
Yep.
No.
We can excuse him and then we can put him on a.
All right. Then call the roll call, I guess.
Senator Beitman,
Excused.
Senator Cooper,
Here.
Senator Rothfuss,
Here.
Senator Wasserberger,
Excused.
Chairman Anderson.
Here. Okay, the first order of business is a continuation of the Senate File 71, the Deregulated Industrial Power Zone, and we left it off with the public comment. We had 5 people that wanted to comment, and I think they're here this morning to comment. So we'll open up public comment on Senate File 71.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Bruce Acey, and I appear here today on behalf of Montana Dakota Utilities Group. Montana Dakota serves in the northern part of the state. It serves electricity in Sheridan and Buffalo. It serves natural gas in other areas. I'd also note that it serves in a number of other jurisdictions, Montana, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, and as part of its utilities group, has a service through Intermountain in Idaho and Cascade in Oregon. So it has a broad group, an area that it serves. And as part of this, and in addressing the concerns that have been discussed in this bill, I would note that our experience is in these jurisdictions that with respect to particularly crypto miners, that what we see is that it's kind of 30-30, 30. In other words, there's a segment of the population that really are not experienced. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the funding. There are others that are getting there. And then there's a segment that really do have funding and the wherewithal and the expertise. And with respect to those individuals, our experience is that we are entering into contracts with them to provide power. And we're doing that right now. And so with respect to the bill and the idea of deregulated zones, we think that in many respects, we're providing the service that needs to be provided. There's been a lot of characterization with respect to rates and expensive rates. We believe that even with respect to industrial rates, our rates in the state of Wyoming, and I'm speaking generally throughout the state, we believe the rates in Wyoming are competitive. And while we recognize that there are deregulated areas, I would hasten to remind the committee that even if you look at Texas, we're suffering through a very steep increase in rates because of the fiasco that occurred a year ago in Texas. So there are some real benefits from regulation to protect not only just residential consumers, but all consumers, and would ask that the committee keep that in mind. The last thing the committee said to us in the interim session that we had was, well, you guys are just saying yet, what do you have for us? Why don't you propose something? And we haven't forgot that. We left the room and we've been discussing that ever since. What do we have that we can propose to you that would be beneficial? And we do think there are proposals, but we think this is complicated, and we are urging the committee to, set this aside for more study. And one area that, would particularly like to mention to the committee is the fact that I believe that you might have somewhat of a misperception with respect to utility service. As a investor-owned utility, Montana, Dakota, we have a duty to serve. That means that anybody that comes to us, we have to address that request. It's a duty and a responsibility that we have by statute, and it's very important. Important for consumers, particularly if you don't have service. It means if you're a new development or you're a new industrial customer, or whatever it is, when you come to an investor-owned utility or any of the regulated utilities in the state, we have to address that request for service. And that's important. The area that I think, and maybe I'm wrong, please correct me. I believe there's a perception that, well, we can sit up there and say, you got a request for service? Nah, we don't want to serve you. That's not how it is. We have to, address the request. And if in fact the request is such that we can't serve for whatever reason, if we don't have the power, you're 200 miles away or whatever it is, then we have to indicate that. And that allows that person, whatever it is, entity that is requesting the service, gives them an opportunity to look elsewhere. It's still going to be subject to PSC approval, but if we can't serve, that doesn't prevent that entity from looking someplace else. And I think that's fundamentally important to remember. And again, just like the proposed bill, it is subject to the PSC and their review and what's in the public interest. Why are we so defensive? Well, one reason is because if you look around, particularly in a rural state, what's our airline service like? Awful, right? What kind of problems are the newspapers going through in the state? It's a problem that we have, all over, but particularly in a rural state when we lose subscribers. When you lose a major subscriber, it falls on other subscribers to pick up that load. And if you continue to lose them, it's called a death spiral. And, eventually it's a real problem. I just read an article in the Sheridan paper yesterday that talked about a problem that, Ranchester and Dayton are having with respect to gas service and trying to get enough customers so that they can support appropriate service. So for us, we want subscribers. And so when an individual or an entity comes to us and is requesting service, we want to provide that load. And that is the main thing I wanted to extend and express to you. We believe there's problems with the bill. I know you would like a simple solution that would address this. I believe it's much more complicated than that, but I do believe we have been discussing options that might be available, and one would be perhaps codifying the mechanism that is utilized for requests, so that would provide maybe comfort to the committee that that if somebody is making a request and we're not adequately addressing that request, that there are options available. And we would argue that option is available now, and has been availed by different entities in attempting to obtain appropriate, not just electrical service, but also gas service and other utility service. And because of that, on behalf of Montana, Dakota, we would request that, we respect the committee's endeavor here, but we would request that this be put aside for a little more study during the interim, and that's what we would be requesting. But thank you for your attention today, and particularly I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, your courtesy in allowing us to talk this morning. And I know you guys are busy, and I appreciate your time and allow us to speak this morning. I'm available for questions.
Yep. Any questions for Mr. Assay with MDU? Any questions? Any questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Bruce, for coming.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
members of the committee, Sean Taylor with the Wyoming Rural Electric Association. I'm going to kind of speed through this because I got another bill up in the Senate Corporations Committee and I'm watching them right now. So I would echo what Mr. Acey said. I also remind the committee of the comments that Ms. Anderson with the PRBRC said yesterday. She laid out a pretty good litany of issues. And I think it's fair to say that we also have that same and maybe even more questions and problems with the potential outcome of this bill. And Senator Rothfuss, I really appreciate our conversation we had last night. I think we kind of both understand each other. The one thing I would say is we would also urge the committee to make this an interim study and not studying for studying's sake. I think part of the study in the interim would be why maybe this bill isn't the right answer, but then the other half would be what is the right answer? And in that time, I know I would be able to tap into bigger brains than mine at our generation and transmission cooperatives that are already working with some mining companies. There's one under contract outside of Pine Bluffs. I've mentioned this during the blockchain committee. We have, in some of our co-ops, we have excess capacity. In Senator Wasserberger's neck of the woods, Precor, they served all the coal bed methane and the coal mines, and with the coal bed methane going away and production at the mines dipping somewhat, they have some excess capacity and are currently talking to miners at the Wheatland power plant. Also, we anticipate, due to some things going on in Colorado, that there will be some excess capacity coming out of Laramie River Station at the Wheatland REA, and those folks also are talking to miners right now. So this is kind of happening organically. I know it's not happening as fast and maybe at the size that the Senator Rothfuss and the blockchain committee particularly would like. But I just would urge caution. We're doing the right things. We're doing what we can right now, given the circumstances. This particular legislation, I think, might harm that. But I don't, Senator Rothfuss and I talked about this last night. I don't like studying for studying's sake either. So I would say, just say it again, maybe, one meeting we talk about why maybe this isn't the right approach, but then the rest of the summer we commit to bringing the right people in to figure out what we can do to achieve the goals that the blockchain and this committee, I think, want. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions.
Mr. Chairman.
Questions for Mr. Taylor? Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do appreciate our conversation as well and understand certainly the interests of the cooperatives. And as we've discussed, there are a lot of ways in which the interests of the co-ops align with the state's interests, but there are some ways, honestly, where the state is looking for things that aren't really within the direct obligations or interests of the cooperatives, their shareholders, their boards. And so I think this is an area where I don't disagree in any way that this isn't helping necessarily the cooperative's interests. I actually think it might. We talked about that a little bit, and depends on how this goes. The challenge does get to the timeliness in some ways, where if we look at things and study things, opportunities pass by, and we look around the country at large projects that are being undertaken in other states, multi-billion-dollar projects, we're never even in consideration for those. And the first time that I've been involved in site selection, so to speak, with large projects where they're looking around the country and they're seriously considering Wyoming, really is with these crypto projects, where people are telling us why. And we heard some testimony about, well, we have the obligation, and this is accurate, I think, as utilities to provide power when asked. That's part of the obligation under the regulation. But it's sort of the full freight PSC approved rate that you're obligated to provide power at. And I assume, although I don't know, that if it's a substantial amount of power, that rate might end up having to increase. So I guess the question I have is, if someone does come in to a region where one of the co-ops is has the agreement, the franchise, right? And says, I need 500 megawatts of power. First question is, do you believe that you'd have the obligation to meet that? And I assume you would, but walk me through the timeline and the change in expenses and who pays for that and how it gets paid for. If somebody says, I need 500 sustained 24/7 megawatts, and I want it in, Campbell County or wherever the case may be. I think you've got a co-op up in Campbell, if I'm not mistaken. A good one, in fact, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, we do have a good one up there.
You do.
I can't answer that question, but it kind of goes to my point. If this were an interim study, I would have the right people in the room to answer that question and walk you all through exactly what would happen in that instance. So that's my best answer.
All right, thank you for that. And I'll say, Mr. Chairman, that what I chatted with Sean about is I do think this should be an interim study, but I think it should be an interim study with the bill passed, really. And the amount of time that it takes for the bill to go into effect, I'm very sensitive, I think, to the request that July 1st is too soon to get the rules in place. We heard some testimony on that. I think that's very realistic. So if this were to go into effect effectively December 1st, 2022, or January 1, 2023, whatever the case may be, we'd be coming right back into session. And so while we're moving this forward, we could have that study, and there'd be a very short period of time before we were in the legislative session if we were convinced that this wasn't the right path forward, that there was a better path. So we're working in parallel instead of holding things back. And as I mentioned to you, and Mr. Chairman, I think you know this about me as well, I don't like to take the slow path. We've done that for a lot of years, and we have a declining economy and the last place growth of any state in the country over the last decade, I think, to show for that. So I'm hopeful that we can come up with better solutions. I really am. But in the absence of better solutions, I think this is a good one. And Sean, what are your thoughts about that process?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if is that a thing? Like, can you pass a bill and it comes into law and still study it? And then what if out of that interim study, like I said, if the first half of the study were to talk about why this isn't a good idea because of all the unintended consequences that come with a deregulated zones here and there, and we come up with a better idea, then do you come back and repeal this law and pass a new one? Is that? Yeah, I don't know. I would just assume maybe it not move forward, but with the commitment from everybody that we get on our horses and ride and try and figure this out, because I just think this could cause some unintended consequences further down the road, maybe even not having to do with crypto mining. That deregulated zone could expand, and that causes us a lot of concern. So again, with all due respect, Senator Office, I would rather see it just tabled and let's get going on an interim study, a serious interim study, like we talked about.
Other questions for Mr. Taylor? Other questions? Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you.
More questions from never slow Senator Rothfuss to come.
Off like a shot.
Yeah, he really serious about that, wasn't he?
It's gone.
That bill upstairs is really important, apparently. Mr. Chairman, David Bush with Black Hills Energy. We are also an investor-owned utility based in South Dakota. We have electricity service here in Cheyenne, served under Cheyenne Light Fuel and Power, which we were known for years. But basically in the Cheyenne area, a little bit up in northeast Wyoming, Newcastle, which is served by our South Dakota utility, Black Hills Power, and then natural gas throughout a lot of the eastern part of the state, central part of the state. So as was mentioned yesterday by one of the other witnesses, we have been working with crypto miners here in Cheyenne for a while. There was legislation a couple of years ago that we helped pass that kind of nicknamed the blockchain interruptible service tariff. It didn't get used for a while, frankly, because there wasn't as much crypto mining activity in the state. There was a lot of foreign activity in crypto mining, and they weren't coming to Wyoming as much. We had some requests early on, and then it kind of petered out. That all changed last summer, I guess, when China expelled the miners. A lot of them started coming back to the States. We started seeing a huge uptick in requests for power. Our folks in Rapid City decided to put together a reverse RFP process, asked for basically an application. Let us know what you need, how much power you want, all that, and we'll see what we can do. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I believe it was about 15 groups that applied and asked for power. That total power amount was right around 1.9 gigawatts, which is a lot of power. Our average load in Cheyenne per day is about 225, 230 megawatts. We peaked this past summer at 274 megawatts. So 1.9 gigawatts is a lot for us. We did look through those applications closely. I wasn't involved in that process as the government affairs guy, but our business development folks looked through it and kind of whittled the list down to work with some groups that we thought were, as some others have mentioned, groups that were well-financed and also in the realm of possibility for us. We don't have hundreds of megawatts of excess capacity. We just don't. We have not overbuilt our generation to serve load like that. The Public Service Commission would definitely have a problem with us overbuilding our system for that. Which gets to my point of we do have a group that we're working with carefully. We're close to having something done there, which is exciting for us. It's a load size that we can serve right now. It didn't require more generation build. I think it will require some infrastructure build out, which this group has been apparently okay with building out, that sort of thing. So we've had some issues along the way with some of these groups when we talk to them and express how much it's going to cost. They balk at that because there is going to have to be some poles and wires put up, transformers, all the things that it takes to move that much power. And it also comes down to time. You may have heard that there's a little bit of a problem with getting parts and pieces these days for pickup trucks, whatever it may be. Same thing goes on the electrical side. I asked my manager, I think last I heard we were about 18 months out on things like transformers. He just said gas meters, transformers, wire is all 12 months at least. So it takes time. We have been engaged and publicly, I think you've all seen that we have had some larger data centers come to Cheyenne lately. That's been a wonderful process for us. It's also been a process that worked well because they had time. They weren't looking for the power tomorrow. They were looking for it in a year, which gave us time while they were building their facility. It gave us time to build out the infrastructure. So that's another difference when we're talking about the difference between crypto miners and more traditional data center. Both potentially great for us. We love to sell electricity. Data miners use a lot. Bitcoin miners use a lot of electricity, as you've heard. What that takes, I think, to get to Senator Rothfuss's question, I can't answer with distinct timelines, kind of like Sean couldn't, but like I said, with the supply chain issues, building out some of that stuff has been where the conversation usually ends. Price, of course, is part of it. Looking up on EIA's website, Wyoming is very competitive on our pricing of electricity, speaking generally throughout the country. I know there's some groups that get frustrated at the price, but we're pretty competitive when it comes to rates. The issue of finding a rate and paying for everything that comes with it is where we've gotten hung up, I think, and that's where the kind of the genesis of this bill has come from. From our conversations with the blockchain committee, the crypto miners that came to Wyoming and wanted that power were frustrated that we couldn't just give it to them. I get that. If we could figure out a way to sell 1.9 gigawatts, our investors and our board of directors would be very happy very quickly. I think we need to, I like the others' ideas of looking at this more long-term. I understand that we want to strike while the iron's hot and make sure we pick up on those opportunities that they're here. But I think the point is too that we couldn't do that right now, even without this bill. There are other factors at play, including the fact of the availability of power. Even if we had 1.9 gigawatts available on the wholesale market, we don't have the transmission to get it here. That takes time. We're working on trying to fix some of that as some of these issues come up, but it all takes time and there's a process. With the bill, I think on that with transmission, my folks have flagged a section that I think might cause some issues with the bill. If I could, Mr. Chairman, on page 6, line 9, subsection F, there seems to be some question on whether or not this would be an issue that would be covered by FERC and not by the Public Service Commission. Anytime you interconnect to interstate transmission, it's FERC purview. So that's some of the question there on that specific piece. The rest of the bill, I think my colleagues have brought up some good points about some of the issues questions that we have as far as if, say, a third party does want to do this, are they going to build on-site generation? And if they're going to build on-site generation to serve 200 or 300 megawatts, you can't just roll out a trailer with a diesel generator on it and serve that kind of load. You're going to need to build some serious generation. Now there's potentially some coal-fired generation that could become available for sale in the next couple of years. That might be a good option. But we've also heard in blockchain committee and others that coal-fired generation sometimes is not what they're looking for. They're looking for more renewables, which again brings us back to the wholesale market and issues there that could come up if we're pulling that much power off the wholesale market. That squeezes the market for other users in the state and could potentially increase costs down the road too. So I guess my point in all this information and testimony is we're working as best as we can to serve these miners and others. There's other bigger concerns that are constantly coming to our local economic development group looking for a place to move to. And I think we're doing the best we can to responsibly serve that load while also protecting our existing customers, because that's another piece of this that has also been touched on, is we have other customers that we need to worry about. As you may have seen, the price of natural gas has, from last year's storm, all those costs are now starting to hit customers' bills, which we don't want to increase those costs by having the electric side also go up. So I think with that, Mr. Chairman, I would again say that this is an interesting idea. I think the idea of using state lands to gain more revenue with business development rather than some other uses is probably something to look at. But I think when it comes to electricity and the amount of time this legislature has spent on electricity in the past few years, I think we really need to take a close look at this and see if this is the right way to do it. So with that.
Okay, before we grill Mr. Bush, I should have introduced some legislators in the room. Representative Olson and Representative Winter, or Western, are here to.
You wrote it right.
I wrote it right.
He wrote it right. He wrote it right.
I just, you looked a little smaller than Western did. Anyway, welcome to the Senate Minerals Committee. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Bush? Question, yes.
This might show my ignorance, but it's just driving me crazy, so I'm gonna ask it. So why do these mining operations need so much power? It seems to me you told us that 1.9 gigawatts is like 10 times the amount of power of the entire city of Cheyenne. So it's like a community of 600,000 or 700,000 people.
Correct.
Why do they need so much electricity?
I'm sure there are people that could answer that, but it's more with more detail than I can. But it's just the computing. It's the amount of power that it takes to run the miners that are the computers that basically are out there looking for Bitcoins. They're doing their algorithms and mathematics, and there's someone else in the audience here that I'm sure can fill you in more on that. But
And I imagine that they probably need cooling to keep the computers. I know at least when we build schools, we're having a room that we air condition and keep at the same temperature all the time. And I'm assuming that they're doing that too.
I believe so. Yeah, I think that's again what's attractive about Wyoming as well as our and same with traditional data centers is there's our weather is conducive to keeping things cool, as you can tell lately. So that's a big part of it, is the amount of power it takes. It does take some real estate to put these things up. For a while, they were just putting them in like shipping containers. When we first had miners coming to Cheyenne and asking us about power, they were talking about just metal shipping containers. They line them with their the miners, the computers inside, plug in, and away they go. Mostly looking at business parks, because business parks here in Cheyenne, we've built out with Cheyenne Leads. We've got transformers. We've got power available for tenants to come into those business parks. So it again, we got hung up on price. They were looking for something usually about half of what we could provide. So that's what I know about it. I'm sure Senator Rothfuss may even know more about that, but they do take an immense amount of power. And early on, in 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of mining in the Pacific Northwest and areas like that because there was a lot of hydropower in those areas, and hydropower is the least expensive. And then those communities started shutting those down because the miners were using up a lot of the allotment of the hydropower, and other people's rates were going up. So they had to figure out something there. In Oregon or Washington, one of the two, they came up with some unique answers to try to serve that. I think our legislation that we did a couple of years ago was kind of based on some of that to try to model what they did up there to serve that load in particular. We haven't built new generation for the miners. It's all market wholesale purchases. So.
Oh, nope. One question, where does your power come from? Do you have a power plant in South Dakota?
We have coal-fired generation up in Campbell County at the Neil Simpson. So we've got Wyodak as our coal mine. Dig it out, put it on a conveyor, run it under I-90, and burn it over in Wyodak or in the Neil Simpson complex. And then we have a gas plant east of town here. It's about 135 megawatts of capacity. And then we have some wind power that we built 2 years ago. I'm messing up my dates. Anyway, a year or so ago, just west of Cheyenne here, 52.5 megawatts, but that was actually a subscription deal. So we had customers in South Dakota and here in Cheyenne that wanted wind power. And instead of them building it on their own or something like that, we built it for them with 20 or 25-year contracts. So it's not been rate-based to other customers. It's just for those customers that wanted it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Senator Cooper.
Mr. Fish, does Black Hills have any future plans for utilizing the advanced nuclear technology at all?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, I'm not in those discussions, but I haven't heard anything quite yet on that. Our coal fleet still got some useful life to it, so we're focused on that, and we're looking at carbon capture. I'm sure their conversations are happening in Rapid City about the nuclear and what's happening here in the state, but I'm not aware of anything right now.
Go ahead.
I'd be more interested in, rather than coal replacement, new build out somewhere else. Just didn't know if you had any plans that way or not.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, not that I'm aware of, but I can have our folks give me some answers on that.
Other questions for Mr. Bush? Yes.
So, Mr. Bush, you talked about kind of timeline and time frame, and I think that's an important point of discussion, that from your perspective, slowing this down and taking some time, and as you and others have said, kind of doing it right and studying it is a good path, but I don't think there's any risk associated with that in any way, because from the perspective of your company or any of the companies here, if we studied it for 5 or 10 years, there would be no negative consequence. And you will continue to build out exactly as needed. You've got plans that are based on expectations of population growth. I don't think it matters to any of the companies whether there are any gigawatt facilities coming up in Wyoming, because again, you've got a return on investment that's being looked after on behalf of the company, and it's succeeding based on the current policies in place. So we've talked about this before. I'm totally sympathetic and understand fully that if I were in the shoes of your board of directors or you or anyone else associated with the company, I'd be in the same position you are. This is where we potentially come into some conflicts of what our respective interests are. But getting to the timeline question, if we had a desire, somebody comes along and says, hey, I need a gigawatt of power. I want to put in a large steel plant and need a tremendous amount of electricity. What would that look like from a timeline? Do you have a sense of that, or would I need to kind of touch base with someone else, which we can certainly do? But do you have a sense of how long that would take and what would go into that process?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I think what it would be is a significant timeline if you're talking about something like a steel factory. I mean, obviously, you'd have to build that, which, again, like the data centers we've worked with here, we've had time to get the materials that they need, the poles and the wires and everything else, which they've also paid for. And while they're building their building, we're building the infrastructure to serve it. It's a more traditional model that we can work with easily and get that done. Now, if it was something like that that would create a need for building generation, we go through the Public Service Commission, file a CPCN, and do that process. With that timeline, I can certainly get you in touch, and at a hearing in the future, have our folks come in and talk more directly about a timeline in a scenario like that, and try to lay it out for you and different examples. But that would be my thoughts on it. Is if you have a structure like that or a load of that size, generally it comes with a facility that needs to be constructed. There has been some good stories. I think it was in Pennsylvania. There was, speaking of steel, there was a steel factory that got shut down that had about a gigawatt of power already wired to it. And the miners went in, bought the plant, and set up shop there, and no problems. They just hit the switch and started going. We just don't have any of those facilities around here.
And Mr. Chairman, I mean, that's a concern that we've discussed before, is that it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem under the current system, and there's no motivation to do anything quickly. There just isn't, because if the timeline that you can provide doesn't work for the company, from the state's perspective, if they go someplace else, that's a real concern. But honestly, I don't know if from any of the company's perspectives, it's much more than okay. Because it's an ROI-based concept. So yes, I'm sure you'd be happy to build out another gigawatt if that came through. But if it doesn't come through, okay. And I guess therein lies the concern with going through the entirety of the process where you've only got one player that you can work with. So it's not like in a certain region, I could go to someone else. If I didn't like your answers, go down the street and ask somebody else. You need to go a long ways down the street and ask somebody else. And that's what tends to happen is the street leads to a different state. And I don't know, I know that you also would like to be involved in trying to find alternative solutions. And maybe one thing that we need to be thinking about as we move forward in this discussion is not only what can we do to bring the cost down, but what can we do to expedite a process such that we appear nimble? And I don't think we appear nimble.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I think on that, electricity is difficult to get a hold of. And if you want it at that size, that's where we've run into issues. Because the transmission, we use WAPA, the Western Area Power Authority, to move some of our load in. You would have to find somebody that has existing transmission lines with the capacity that you could buy and move the electricity on there. So even if it wasn't us, if this bill passed and say somebody comes in and says, I need 300 megawatts of power for my crypto mining operation south of Cheyenne, we say, boy, we'd love to do that, which we would. We want to grow. Growth is important to us. It's everything that our board of directors and our investors look for. We're in the business to grow, hence why we've worked so hard to bring those data centers here. So if we can build the generation and have that person pay for it, great, because that's the key. That person needs 300 megawatts. The rest of Cheyenne doesn't need that 300 megawatts. So we can't rate base that to other folks for that load that may not be here in a couple of years. Who knows? So that's when you get into, okay, let's buy it on the wholesale market. Well, once you get into that process, then you got to find somebody, a marketer, to go buy it for you. You got to find the transmission and put it on the lines and pay that fee, or build your own transmission. So then you're back to where you're on the timeline of finding the lines and the poles to build into this spot. So we're still in a situation of it takes time, unless you find a spot like a steel mill that is already wired for that.
Mr. Chairman, one more quick follow-up.
Okay,
I think
one
we're still
quick
on time.
follow-up, yeah.
But we do have circumstances like that. It's just that they really can't be accessed within the state's laws. An example of that would be if I had a large wind turbine farm and I'm primarily selling probably to a state to our west. Sometimes the wind blows very strongly and demand might be low, and my power is all of a sudden probably worth about a penny at that point in time. Other times it's worth quite a bit. It wouldn't seem unreasonable, objectively, stepping away from the regulated utility structure, it wouldn't seem unreasonable for that company to sell directly to a cryptocurrency mining operation, which is co-located with them, assuming that they had the interconnect available, which again, you're scaling up at different places. I don't think that's a rocket science at that point. You're working harder to step it up to the appropriate voltage than than you might be to get it to an appropriate mining system. Right now in Wyoming, that would be illegal. They would have to sell to you, and you would have to sell to them, and it wouldn't even necessarily be you unless you happen to have the wind farm in your territory. It would be whoever was there, and it would be at full retail value, the price, unless they wanted to enter into one of these negotiated tariffs in some way. So, and again, that was good legislation, and you know I appreciate the work that you did on that. We've done some good things there.
Sure.
But it doesn't seem like there really objectively needs to even be any engagement of anyone. You have a corporation that produces power, you have a corporation that consumes power, they co-locate. It seems pretty reasonable in that circumstance. Now, I understand a lot of our concerns about you need to be able to anticipate load, you need to be able to build to that. This is a discussion we've had before, so I'm not saying that everyone should be able to just negotiate those rates freely, but this is trying to capture that type of I don't need the regulated utility for this massive transaction. But our system requires that we have the regulated utility, and even as an abstraction, if what you're serving in the value chain is to buy power from a provider over here, or a producer, excuse me, and sell it to a consumer right here, and that's your role in this process, I don't know that it's to the advantage of the state to have you in the process if this negotiation directly is available and saves money for the consumer, which again, this doesn't fully realize, but it allows for the possibility of that opportunity if you're not adding value to it. And you might, and generally you are, because you're going to be building out lines, you're going to be using your infrastructure, so I'm not saying you wouldn't. So the question then is, why do we need all of the restrictions all of the time when they're not providing efficiencies for business and industry? I understand it 95% of the time, but why do we have to have the same size, one size fits all solution for all instances?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that is a interesting point. And I think, from our standpoint, of course, we'd love to serve any of that load, obviously. There's load degradation that we have to, I think, be opposed to, especially in this day and age where, again, we've been encouraged to keep coal-fired burning and grow that load and not shut anything down early and build more renewables or anything like that. We're trying to do our best to keep as much load on our system as possible. However, I think there's also a point to be made that along with being a regulated utility for the sake of our customers, there's maintenance, there's things like that is done on those lines that comes with that cost. Now, as you pointed out, I mean, right now you can build your own generation. If you're drilling oil out in the middle of somewhere, you want to have your own generation for that well, as long as you're not connected to the grid, you're doing just fine. And that instance of a wind power producer that's selling someplace west, they have excess capacity to sell to somebody local, perhaps that's something that we could look at. I don't know all the details on how that would work. I think, again, I'd have to get my folks that are more knowledgeable about that to give you a real succinct answer. But I think, yeah, philosophically, that's one of the questions that I think we need to answer.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Bush? Other questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Bush.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for being with us today.
Yes, thanks, Dave.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Rick Kaysen. I am with Rocky Mountain Power, and I think you're very familiar with Rocky Mountain Power, so I don't need to tell you too much about that company. Okay, I will, in the spirit of time and many hours last night and more hours you have this evening, we'll try to condense my comments. Rocky Mountain Power has participated in the meetings that the Select Committee on Blockchain Technology held over the interim. There were in-depth discussions during this from all parties, but we still have continued concerns with regards to this very complex topic, and it is very complex. And we even heard at the last meeting of the blockchain technology that, again, about the complexity, about the need for clarity, the need for more discussion, and that was from the committee itself. I'd like to hit a couple of points that, and not be repetitive as much as I can. We've talked about growing load by a utility. That's very critical. It's very important to a utility in growing that load, in bringing those users into the company's service. But it has to be viable for all parties, including all the other customers as well. So there's a financial, piece of this equation as well that I think we have to look at. Rocky Mountain Power has also issued requests for proposals as far as trying to find that power to bring into the state. Even though we are an exporting state, at the same time, we're looking to see where that power might be able to come from. And those RFPs are currently undergoing analysis as far as what's going to be very economically viable for all customers again. It's been mentioned on a couple of occasions about the high cost of power in Wyoming. The U.S. The federal U.S. Energy and Information, the Edison Electric Institute have published reports. They do this on a very frequent quarterly basis. It shows that Wyoming rates are extremely competitive, some of the lowest in the nation on all of our customers, or for all of our customers, excuse me. And I'm talking about across the state, just not Rocky Mountain Powers. And Rocky Mountain Power is proud of the rates that they'll be able to provide to their rates, again, with good planning. I loved the question about the timeline and the discussion on the timeline as well. That is critical as far as making these projects or any project work. That's why a company conducts an integrated resource plan where you look at all of the components that are going to go into the requirements to serve all customers. And so, and the IRPs address timelines. So again, that mechanism or that vehicle is already in place. And it's a very viable one because, again, the commission gets a chance, the Public Service Commission gets a chance to weigh in on that, as does the public. And when we think about the integrated resource plans, again, that takes into consideration what the projected load is going to be. And we're talking large loads with these crypto minings and what have you. So that is a critical piece as well. It's been mentioned that a state in this country, the southern part of this country, is a very attractive place for crypto mining because of their power rates and what have you. I would also suggest that we maybe take a look to the West Coast. There's a state out there that had ventured into the area of deregulation, and it's been found that there's been many flaws in that particular state with regards to deregulation. So maybe we can also learn from those flaws and try to make it better for Wyoming as well. I think Senator Rothfuss has brought up some great topics this morning, in addition to the topics that we've had before, when he was thinking about the wind power and when it's down and when it's up and what have you. And the reason I say that, again, I think that is indicative of the topics that we still need to take a look at, the complexity of this issue as well in continued discussion. And as my cohort utilities have stated, we're there. We're at the table with you to talk about this in greater length, in more depth. We've talked about certificated service territories in this discussion. We've talked about the federal government, the state government involvement, the impact, potential impact on other customers as well. So without going into a great litany of those concerns, again, I would ask the committee to think about the complexity of this topic and encourage continued discussion. And I'll repeat myself, utilities will be at the table with you to try to find that better solution. And with that, sir, I'll try to answer questions the committee may have.
Any questions for Mr. Kaysen? Hearing none?
Thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Rick. Thanks for being with us this morning and last night. Thank you. Anyone else? And there are. Anyone else?
Chairman Anderson, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is Elizabeth Arano. I'm with the Wyoming Outdoor Council. I'll be brief. We heard several times yesterday that the cost of electricity in Wyoming is deterring businesses, but we have questions. It's a big ask to change our regulatory system for a new industry. Regarding rates, following up on what Rocky Mountain Power mentioned, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration website, industrial prices as of November 21st, the most recent data available, were in Texas, 6.17 cents per kilowatt hour, and in Wyoming, 6.44 cents per kilowatt hour. This is only a difference of 4%. Looking more broadly at some of the costs for operating in a state, neither Wyoming nor Texas has a corporate or regular income tax. However, Texas has a gross receipts tax of 6.7%, unlike Wyoming, which has no such tax on businesses. We're only one of 2 states with neither a corporate income tax nor a gross receipts tax. More importantly to us, we remain unclear that these deregulated zones are really needed in the state with our industrial rates and business-friendly tax structure. We encourage further work with county commissioners, the utilities, and other parties before moving this bill forward, and would remind you of the testimony yesterday regarding the need for bonding and financial assurance for these speculative industries, as well as other concerns raised regarding having 2 systems in the state, and these concerns have yet to be addressed. Thank you, and I will stand for questions.
Any questions for Liz? Hearing none, thank you, Liz, for being with us this morning. Shannon, you go ahead and add.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. I wanted to address Senator Rothhaus's question about moving the bill forward and still conducting interim study. And I would push back against that, and I think particularly because the bill calls for rulemaking. And I think it would be really difficult for state lands to start a rulemaking process, and then all of a sudden the rules change in the middle of the game, and then you're gonna have to go back and change their rulemaking. So it's not just the law and the bill, but it's also the rules. I also think the bill will necessitate some county rulemaking. You heard some testimony yesterday from the counties that they're going to have to work this out on their end as well. And so there will be some process after this bill goes forward and rules. And so I think, again, thinking of that timeline and making sure we have the right legal framework in place before any rules kind of get ahead of the game. And then the other thing I would just mention is, we talked a little bit about building new load and generation resources. I would remind you that there's things called depreciation schedules. Generally utilities don't build a gigawatt of power for one customer. And the reason for that is what if that customer ups and leaves? There's a lot of stranded assets, and that's a big concern. So again, it's a very complex topic. It's not as easy as just building a gigawatt power and serving new load. We have to do it right. So thank you.
Questions for Ms. Anderson? Questions for Ms. Anderson? Hearing none, thank you. Thank you, Shannon, for being with us this morning and last night. Anyone else like to speak on Senate File 71? Anyone else on Senate File 71? Is there anyone on the Zoom?
Mary had her hand up for a second.
Oh,
No, she wanted to provide clarification.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to respond to the FERC issue that Mr. Bush raised. I had also flagged that as a concern, but I think the language that you have in there already as otherwise regulated by the Public Service Commission, addresses a FERC issue. But Mr. Bush is correct. I think, as you know, that FERC regulates the bulk of the transmission in our country, or maybe all of it.
questions for Ms. Throne? Thank you, Mary. Thanks for being with us last night and today. If there's no other public comment, we'll close public comment. And committee, I think we've heard some good testimony and some good suggestions of making this an interim topic. And so I would like to table this bill and make it an interim topic.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a lot of additional discussion, but I think that we can be passing this bill and developing the rules and regulations, which we literally do all the time, where you're developing the rules and regulations, but the bill is going to change and that adjusts itself if there are better ideas. We have done a tremendous job over the years of wasting opportunity. and not providing an appropriate regulatory framework for anybody to do anything at a large scale in the state of Wyoming, which is why we keep referring to literally one project over and over again as the showpiece single project for where it's worked in the state of Wyoming. There are states that have, you read the newspaper and you see 3 giga projects going in other states in a week. With regard to the power prices, you can pull up the EIA, and while there's no question that for this last November, Texas was at 6.17 and we were at 6.44. Texas 1 year before was at 4.8. And Nevada is currently at 4.5. Ours isn't going to change. Ours is regulated, flatline. The reason Texas is different is because it's deregulated. And we're not trying to deregulate everything, but they've got a market. So it just happens to be kind of bad right now because they, crushed their whole system last year, and they're probably still regretting it. But it was the reason why people were locating there, and then that's the average price, which can be negotiated. We don't have that opportunity. We've been talking about this too long, Mr. Chairman. The entire time I've been on this Minerals Committee, this is my 12th year, we have failed to accomplish any significant project. We've done 0. We've been talking about it every year I've been on here, and we have a batting average of 0 on large-scale projects that we've talked about here and then we've seen happen. That's not a great batting average. So we can push the pause button. It's what we've done before. It's why we don't have carbon capture and sequestration. We paused that project and then killed it, the YCUS project. It was too hard, cost money. Let's not do that one. And that tends to be the end game mantra. And a lot of the time it comes from objections from industry because we're changing things in a disruptive way. Disruption is bad for existing industry and business. They will always push back, and they should, because it's not in their economic interest to do anything but push back against innovation if they're not the ones that are innovating. This bill is disruptive. It is not as disruptive as a full deregulation, which I think would be an absolute disaster. As the good gentleman said a few minutes ago, we can look to a few states and we can see that bad things happen when you do that. This is trying to thread a needle. This is a good, thoughtful bill that's taken quite a bit of testimony through 4 select committee meetings. And I understand that objections are being raised because, again, the folks that are raising objections should be raising those objections. The idea of slow rolling it. Mr. Chairman, this is 1/100th as complicated as the Natrium project, 1,000th. We've got 2 bills going through. You're sponsoring one of them. It's not even in the ballpark of the Natrium project's complexity or that legislation or the NRC interaction with what we're doing in the state. Not even in the ballpark. But that, even though we did push pause because we had some concerns, now we've got 2 mirror bills because we need to get that sucker moving forward when there's a minimum of a 8-year timeline before that even goes into effect. So you can see some circumstances we need to hurry, some we don't. It kind of depends on the specific interests. And once again, I don't hold that against anybody. They're just doing what's best for the folks that they represent and their shareholders. It's our obligation to do what's best for all of the people of the state of Wyoming. We're probably $5 billion plus short on where our GDP should be because we've had declining revenue from an awful lot of industries that are largely in the rearview mirror instead of on the horizon. And the longer and more often we push pause, the less likely we are to do anything about it and to actually recover. So I'd like to move this forward, keep the conversation going, but I am enthusiastic about talking about it in the interim and making it better. And I know that we have good partners to do that with.
So
I'd move the bill.
Sensing you'd like to vote on it. You moved?
Yep.
Is there a second? Is there a second? Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you.
Oh, there is a second. Okay. Okay.
I know we've got some high votes out there too.
Okay, any thing you want to change in the bill at the moment?
Mr. Chairman, you wanted to change the definition of deregulated industrial power zone because you didn't like 640 contiguous. Did you want to do that now? Page 2.
Not particularly,
Not now? Okay.
no.
All right, Mr. Chairman, then the only amendment that I would suggest would be going into the timeline where we had a request. It's July 1st. Let's change those all to December 1st, 2022. So that's page 8, lines 16 and 20. Change both of those to December 1st. And page 9, line 4, change that to December 1st. And that's my motion.
And I'm assuming it has a second. Second, yes. Okay. All in favor of that motion, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, same sign. That amendment's passed. Okay,
Question.
question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh. Senator Wasserberger.
Mr. Chairman, I am intrigued by this bill, but I have serious concerns. And I'm not sure what the right path should be as the layman on this committee. But so I don't know how I'm going to vote yet, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we'll know in a few minutes.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
So here's another thing you can't do right now in Wyoming. You could not have a company that wanted to manufacture hydrogen using electrolysis buy directly from wind turbines as they're producing the power when the costs are low. That's illegal. Can't be done.
Unless
they
it's the
would-
same company.
Unless it's the same company. So if they wanted to be a hydrogen and wind power company and change their entire business model, they could do that. But if they wanted to just be a wind developer that augmented their profits by generating hydrogen in Wyoming, which seems like the kind of thing we'd encourage based on everything we've been working on, they can't do it unless they want to pay literally this 6.44 cents. That's what they would pay. They're not using the transmission line. They're literally over the fence or under a turbine. There's the turbine. Here's the hydrogen generation. No, you can't do that. It's nonsense. And again, this isn't the first time we've had this conversation. If this was a brand new issue and the first time the Minerals Committee had seen, wow, power is causing a problem in Wyoming. Now, the Petroleum Association isn't here and they're not weighing in on this, but how many times have you heard them complain about the power costs in Wyoming? Quite a few. And they always mention, that's our second largest expense, if I'm not mistaken, that we have some of the highest power costs in the states they produce. So that's a little interesting way of phrasing things, Mr. Chairman. We have some of the lowest power costs in the country. That is true when you include all of the states. When you include the power producing, oil producing states, we don't look quite as good. I mean, it's not a huge differential. As I said, we're around 6.44 average industrial, and these other states tend to be in the 4.5 to 5. So that doesn't sound like a lot unless your primary cost is power. And this is a conversation that we've had on this committee for 12 years without a solution, because we push pause, and when we get pushed back, we say, all right, it's complicated. Yeah, it's complicated. And yeah, there's probably going to be issues with this, and yeah, it'll need follow-up legislation. That's all good. So there's my thoughts on your concerns.
The difference is that we're a regulated state, and in respect to the regulated business, that is exactly how it works, like you say. And what we're trying to do with this bill is get around the regulated state. And that's a possibility. I think the companies have said they'd work with that, but I think right now this probably isn't the avenue to do it. So let's call the roll for Senate File 71, Deregulated Industrial Power Zone.
Senator Beitman,
Excused.
Senator Cooper voted absentee no, moved to interim. Senator Rothfuss,
Aye.
Senator Wasserberger,
No.
Chairman Anderson.
No.
Mr. Chairman, you have 1 aye, 3 no, and 1 excused. Do
Thank you.
pass amended, failed.
So that Senate File 71 has failed Minerals Committee, but are you feeling like we shouldn't study it in the interim? Are you thinking
No,
we've
we should.
studied it too much?
We should probably study that.
Okay, I'll put that in as an interim committee subject.
They can kill it in the interim too.
Yeah, yeah. All right, next bill to come before us is a simple little bill. Senate File 106, Wyoming Stable Token Act. And who's presenting this is,
I'll present, but let's
Oh,
get,
okay.
let's get Chairman Olson and Representative Western up here as well. We don't see Representative Western, but he's a co-sponsor, and Chairman Olson's a sponsor on the bill.
okay, let's get Western, sorry about calling you winter. You guys are about the same size. I didn't know. Hey, you look the same. But I apologize for that. Okay, Senator Rothfuss, go ahead with the intro on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Senate File 106, the Wyoming Stable Token Act, is very innovative in terms of taking a new approach to a particular type of cryptocurrency called a stable token, where no other state has issued a stable token or cryptocurrency of any kind. And in fact, I think only one country is recognizing it. That's not necessarily something we want to follow the way they did things. But the idea here is to provide an opportunity where the state of Wyoming can have confidence in a cryptocurrency or a digital asset that is then able to transact in blockchain transactions and in these next generation transactions. This is not a new coin or new currency, and that's why it's called a stable token. The delineation there is a token is a representation of ownership of an asset, where a coin is the asset itself. And the idea here in this legislation is that it'll be a digital representation of a US dollar, and that US dollar is then held in trust by the state of Wyoming and shall be held in treasury bills. Those treasury bills will provide a yield, and that yield will go to the state of Wyoming to provide the operation of it. And if there are enough stable tokens issued, it could represent a substantial amount of money. Right now, in terms of stable coins, the global market cap is around $130 billion of stable coins, which are similar, but again, there'd be less confidence in the marketplace in the existing stable coins because they're not being held by an entity like the state of Wyoming that has full transparency, full auditability, and would be capable of providing confidence to anybody that wanted to transact in that space. So the idea of how this would work is that we would issue these Wyoming stable tokens in exchange for US dollars. So $1 million US come in, or $100 million US come in, and we would provide that digital representation as the Wyoming stable token, which would then be usable and transacted with on blockchains in exchange for cryptocurrencies possibly, but more importantly, would have the capacity to operate on smart contracts, which we've talked some about, and that's the idea of implementing contracts through code, typically using blockchains. And right now, you can't really do that with a US dollar. So you're always using cryptocurrency if you want to engage in a smart contract transaction. There are interests in being able to utilize dollars in smart contract transactions, but there's no capacity to do that. There's consternation at the federal level about how do we go about doing it? How do we regulate it? Other countries are looking at it. The European Union is thinking about issuing its own digital currency, which would basically be something similar to this token of a euro, and even the US Federal Reserve is contemplating it, but they typically are very, very, very slow about embracing and adopting new technologies. So this would position Wyoming as a first mover, and there's a lot of exciting possibilities here if we do move this forward. The legislation is fairly straightforward, but kind of nuanced in terms of the way it's been drafted. You see page 2 and 3 gets into definitions where the stable token is a key concept here. The core of all of the language is on page 3, where you see the Wyoming stable token authorized and the value. The treasurer is authorized to issue Wyoming stable tokens as provided for in this act. And then the B, which is key, a Wyoming stable token is a virtual currency representative of and redeemable for a United States dollar held in trust by the state of Wyoming as provided down below. Duties of the treasurer come into basically developing and administering the stable token. They can retain professional services, utilize financial institutions, and then very specifically, bottom of page 4, the Romanet 3, shall maintain, invest, and reinvest the funds received for issuing Wyoming stable tokens and any earnings from those investments in accordance with investment policies established by the treasurer. But then it explicitly states that they have to be invested in treasury bills, so basically short-term treasuries that would be available. On page 6 is created the Wyoming stable token account, where the dollars that are being held in trust are put and then exchanged for the treasury bills, which you see bottom of paragraph A. The state treasurer shall invest funds within the account exclusively in United States treasury bills. Also on page 6, the B provision gets into a concept of what you do with the revenue off of the treasury bills. First thing you do is pay for some administration with any additional revenue beyond the 100%. And then once the revenue gets above 102%, or I should say the fund is funded in excess of 102%, then additional revenue off of it is evenly split between the Common School Permanent Land Fund and the Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. That's the beginning of page 7. If we were to get to the point where we had $10 billion, for example, which is not unreasonable in this stable token, it would yield $100 million-ish of profit per year. Yeah, revenue for the state. And that's not a tax, it's just revenue generated on effectively the float of the dollars that are being held. And everyone would appreciate the fact that we're holding it because we're doing a service for the community that would be entrusting their US dollars to us to then put in the treasury. Page 7 gets into the redemption, how that works, which basically says, if you want to cash in your token, we will give you back $1. That is subject to rules and regulations of the treasurer, because you don't want to have immediacy of having to cash in the treasury bills. You'll need some time to provide the dollars back, and you'll need a process. You don't want to cash in one, you want to cash in many, so that it's not an administrative burden, and that's all subject to rule, and that's consistent with common practice, so there's nothing contentious about how that works. Page 8, limitations, and then limitation on liability, makes it very clear that the state of Wyoming is not backing any of this with its full faith and credit, and that we are not subject to any liability associated with anything about these dollars beyond the liability of those dollars that are held in the trust. In other words, we're holding dollars in the trust account, and we are obligated to pay back those dollars that are held in that trust account up to the 102%. And there's a reason for that, which is that under a circumstance of payback where the treasuries have begun to go negative rate, which has never happened, these T-bills have never gone negative, but you have to contemplate it, and that's the reason for the 102%. You give a little bit of cushion time for people to cash out if they see that T-bills are going negative. So they should cash out, but then the language is structured that you would only receive your proportionate value of the value of the trust if that value falls below 100. So we're not liable for any losses associated with it. But the way this is structured, you'd really have to not be paying any attention to not get your money back. Nothing happens very suddenly, and with the 102% buffer, you should have plenty of time to liquidate. And there's no liquidation cost as long as the liquidation time is reasonable relative to the time of the investments in the treasury bills. Beyond that, it's conforming amendments, and this currently is structured that the state treasurer shall issue the token not later than December 31st, 2022, and then has some reporting requirements and rules and regulations requirements earlier than that. We can find out what the probabilities of that are, but there is also a provision whereby if the state treasurer finds that anything in this act is problematic or deemed to be unlawful, in other words, if you can't get it done, and I was just looking for that. I somehow bypassed it. They can effectively push the pause button on it.
Page 10.
Page 10.
At the bottom paragraph there, isn't it?
That is correct. Thank you. Yep, bottom paragraph, the B paragraph. If the state treasurer determines that issuing a Wyoming stable token is not feasible by December 31st, 2022 due to incompatible federal or state law, the state treasurer shall not issue a Wyoming stable token, but shall basically give a report to the Capital Finance Committee, and they would also report to the Blockchain Select Committee, obviously, and then provide recommendations on what went wrong. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the bill.
Any questions for the presenter? Any questions? Any questions down here? No, down there. I have a question.
Mhm.
Why would we want to convert dollars to tokens and then back to dollars when we reclaim them? What's the advantage to the state? The state, it looks like we're going to get just what the return is on United States treasuries. That's the same as we could do with the things now. So what's the advantage of doing this?
Mr. Chairman, we can bring up Mr. Fleming, the Chief Investment Officer for the state. He can describe how this would play out. So if we can get Patrick to come up, come on up, Patrick. But I think the key that probably answers your question is this isn't our money, Mr. Chairman. This is someone else's money. If we're holding someone else's money and we're getting the revenue off of someone else's money that's invested in treasuries, that's handy. And Mr. Fleming can probably talk a little bit about how that might work.
Mr. Fleming, have you got a line of people that want to buy tokens?
Mr. Chairman, my name is Patrick Fleming. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for the Treasurer's Office. The vast majority of stable coins are used to move, currently, to move in and out of purchases of some of the more volatile cryptocurrencies. And so the vast majority of the use right now, and just to comment on the growth of the stable coin, as of last night, the total market cap as of last night was 181.5. This has gone, it was $1 billion since it was about 20 billion a year ago. That just shows you the growth. So the vast majority of these coins are used right now just to move back and forth. Now in the future, the smart contracts and so forth that would be used, you're not able to use cryptocurrencies like a Bitcoin to transact in these just because of the volatility. This morning, Bitcoin was down 5.5%. If you entered into a long-term letter of credit, if you would, to receive goods from a foreign country or whatever in 3 months, that wouldn't be a viable use of currency where this would be. So the only way that somebody typically would go out of a coin would be is if they just didn't want to have use of any of these types of assets or just needed cash like you might need in your business or what have you, where you just need to use cash to purchase something else. But the vast majority of it would stay in the coin.
Mr. Fleming, this feels like I could launder some money this way. Is that a possibility in this system? If I invest my 100 million I just made from some drugs into tokens, would it protect it? Would I be able to do that?
Mr. Chairman, all cryptocurrencies would fall in that category, but then also there's US dollars, everything else is used as well. It's easier to launder money in crypto assets, but a stable coin would potentially be an avenue, but it's no different than any other coin that's on the market or any other currency in the world.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Ruffins.
One other point on that is laundering money is actually in some ways a bit harder with public and transparent cryptocurrencies, because literally every transaction of any coin, every coin is available for public perusal for time and eternity, which is not true about a dollar. If I hand you $1, there's no record of that transaction. If I were to hand you one of these Wyoming stable tokens, everyone on the planet would know when you were handed that Wyoming stable token. If I were to launder money, I probably wouldn't use anything like this to do it. And that's not to say that that hasn't happened with cryptocurrency, but I think a lot of the early money laundering with cryptocurrency was with people that didn't understand cryptocurrency very well. That said, there are cryptocurrency technologies that will hide transaction history to some degree. That's an available technology, but that's not what we would want necessarily for this Wyoming stable token. I think having it as a public cryptocurrency and a transparent cryptocurrency is probably the best bet.
So, Mr. Fleming, the state would get the interest off this and whatever the feds are paying at that time, which sometimes isn't very much, because if I go to claim my token, you give me the value of the token. You don't keep part of it. Is that enough money to pay for this service we're providing here?
Mr. Chairman, if you look at the value, so I mentioned the 181.5 billion, this is anticipated to grow to estimates from numerous sources around 2.5 trillion by 2025. And as Senator Rothfuss mentioned, just looking at where T-bills have what we would anticipate. So over the last 30 years, T-bills have averaged around 2.25%. So just look at the percentage of what we could potentially talk about of earning. It is extremely significant. If I was thinking of it last night, but in the 40 years that I've been doing this, I don't know, my business is to look at optionality and how much the value is and so forth. And I don't know if I've ever seen a business model that has the potential of this in terms of optionality. This is the largest, most profitable optionality that I've seen in my 40 years of how much we could make. So how can you quantify that, saying, well, what percentage that you have? The existing stablecoin issuers right now are companies that have just started in the near term, just recently. And last week, the second largest issuer of a stablecoin did a SPAC deal, a special purpose acquisition company, that valued this company at $9 billion, the number 2 issuer. So these are the types of numbers that we're looking at from a business sense. And what we're talking about is just taking the float, not even the business part of it, but just the float, the difference of what T-bills are paying. Right now, inflation is 7.5%. The Fed is anticipating the terminal rate of T-bills right now is around 2.5% before today's attack. But anyway, it's still quite high. And so if you just take that average, say 10 billion at 2%, there's your 200 million per year in just float. It's a extremely interesting opportunity from a financial perspective.
Other questions for Mr. Fleming? Other questions? Other questions? Hearing none, thank you, Mr. Fleming. That was enlightening. I don't know. Are we going to hear from you guys? The other two?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Jared Olson, House District 11, co-chairman of the Blockchain Select Committee. I feel like if I stay here any longer, there will only be one of you left on this committee. But Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you hearing this bill. I think, most of the substance of the bill has definitely already been said. The bill, in my mind, has two very attractive purposes to it. One we've really been focusing on, which is the investment side. For the state of Wyoming, provides a pool of investment money, which has been said will not be the state's money. It will be those who are buying in to receive the tokens money. As I think we all know, the T-bonds are very low risk investments for the states, and obviously Mr. Fleming, much more expert on all of that. I did want to address a question that you had asked, Mr. Chairman, which, beyond what would be the state's interest, but what would be anybody's interest in this if they simply get a token back that's worth their dollar. And Senator Rothfuss had alluded to this earlier, but in more detail, it's liquidity is what it is, and it's the ability to transact in smart contracts. A Bitcoin typical average transaction is in the minutes. 8 minutes, I believe, is the transaction time on a Bitcoin. Coins that deal on a smart contract or proof of stake are much more instantaneous. So the future use, that's why people like to use, as Mr. Fleming indicated, to transact in and out of other currencies, is because of the liquidity. But I think the future potential that this coin could be used for, given its liquidity, whether that is me as a consumer using my Wyoming stable token to make a purchase for fish tacos at let's say a food truck in downtown Cheyenne, and when I do, that point of sale device is connected or speaks to rather the state of Wyoming's revenue department, and I'm able to, for example, pay the taco vendor instantaneously, but also my sales tax doesn't sit inside of that food truck. It's already in the treasury of the state of Wyoming. And so that's not what this bill does, but it's an example of the liquidity of smart contracts and why someone would want to use a coin and why the state of Wyoming would have extreme interest in seeing a coin like this that is tethered to the US dollar, just as an example, and is stable and uses smart contract for the future. So, Mr. Chairman, those are just some examples that I thought would be helpful for you to see real world. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, questions?
Very briefly follow up on that. One of the things that Co-Chairman Olson was discussing is this ability of the state to accept it. Since we've been working on the select committee, it's been very challenging for us to get to the point where we would be comfortable having the state accepting cryptocurrency because it tends to be volatile. Even the stable coins that are out there, while they're not volatile, there is always some question as to whether they're reserved appropriately in a way that we can have confidence, kind of a state level of confidence in engaging in those transactions. One of the nice things, if we did have this Wyoming Stable Token Act in place, is that if somebody paid us in Wyoming Stable Token, we would be sure that it would have its appropriate value, because we would literally be holding the dollars in trust that we wanted to be confident were there when we needed them. And that's a level of certainty that would provide us with the opportunity then to be fully engaged in virtual currency transactions, where right now it's a challenge. But not just the state of Wyoming, then other states would probably have sufficient confidence to engage in those types of transactions too, because they would have confidence in the state of Wyoming's ability to appropriately manage at a much higher level than they would in any of the entities that are currently issuing these stable coins.
Representative Western.
Chairman Anderson, Cyrus Western, House District 51. I'm not going to belabor any of the points that were just made or be repetitive. I think the only thing also I would just add is that, we have to play to our strengths. And one of our strengths in Wyoming is driving revenue off investments. Obviously, a lot of that goes into our common school fund, mineral trust fund, and that's exactly what this does here is it plays to our strengths. It's because of the enormous growth we're seeing in these stablecoin markets, because there's a ton of money being poured into them as for the aforementioned reasons. Here's an opportunity for us to capitalize on that in a fair, transparent way, and we can derive revenue. And in the bill it says the proceeds from this go into our permanent mineral trust fund and our common school land fund. So here's an opportunity for us to continue to play to our strengths, derive income without going through any additional taxation or any of those other kind of options for us to continue to derive revenue on behalf of beneficiaries.
Questions for Representative Wester? Questions? No questions. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you both for being here. Thanks, guys. You bet. Is there anybody else that wants to speak on this? Murphy.
Mr. Chairman and Minerals Committee, my name is Sean Octavius Murphy. I'm here as an investor, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, blockchain investor. Just very briefly, I'm going to give you a very real-world example of this and then explain how investors look at this, because I think it's fundamental that the Minerals Committee understands asymmetric risk and systematic risk, because we're making some big decisions on this committee. I'm watching them be made real time, where we need to be looking out the rear view, or need to be looking out the windshield, not the rear view. Right? These are big decisions for Wyoming. We just watched it happen with the last vote. So a very real example of the stablecoin, which I totally support this bill. I'm going to go home to my house 2 blocks away after this committee meeting. I'm going to transfer US dollars onto Kraken. Kraken is a Wyoming domiciled company. They're one of the 2 special interest depositories. And I'm going to take my US dollars on Kraken, a Wyoming company that I've invested in. That's why I use Kraken, and convert it into USDC, US dollar coin. It's a stable coin backed by the US currency. I'm going to then take my USDC and transfer it, effectively transact it to make an investment in another cryptocurrency. I have to go through that stable coin. It makes the transaction easier. So what this bill ultimately is doing is facilitating transaction, and that is fundamental value creation. We're ultimately creating more transaction capability for Wyoming, which leads to more revenue, more opportunities, more use of digital currencies, more use of the innovation that we're already leading. So this bill is a step to continue the innovation and ultimately be the first state to do this. Miami did this successfully at a city level. If Wyoming can do this at the state level, we'll continue to be the leaders in this. We must be the leaders in this. There's only so many opportunities in Wyoming right now. And one was just shut down in the last vote. So this one right here, as an investor in the room, we look, and I'm going to explain this because it's going to come back up on the nuclear bill, is this idea of asymmetric risk. We look for things with a high upside return and a very low downside return. This one has a high upside with not much risk on the downside. Not much can go wrong because it's on the blockchain ledger. But we're going to look at some things that in other bills, there's a high upside or small upside and a very big downside, And those are the things we need to be careful of, but also pursue the ones that have this asymmetric risk. High upside, low downside. This bill has that, this innovation has that, and that's why I'm in support of this bill.
Questions for Mr. Murphy? Questions for Mr. Murphy? Hearing none, thank you, Mr. Murphy, for being with us last night and this morning. Thank you. Is there anybody on Zoom? Nobody on Zoom? Oh, Mr. Fleming, you're on Zoom?
No, sir. He's also on Zoom. Mr. Chairman, I just had a couple questions on the bill and just other comments that I'd just like to do really quickly. First is, why would someone go to our coin versus USDC, as Mr. Murphy just pointed out? And the opportunity set here to me is this is something that if this is going to happen, it would have to happen soon because other people are going to enter into this. But the difference is the state of Wyoming is perceived as a very different entity. And for instance, if you look at USDC and what they would be purchasing with those, we would be buying USD bills. We know very well what, unless the US government failed, we'd have much bigger problems, but what those values are. These other companies that purchase other assets can be very volatile. And some of them have the largest, Tether, the largest company was fined for not having US Treasury securities as collateral as they stated. But for instance, USDC, they have Yankee CDs, commercial paper, they have many different assets that you don't know what the value would be. So here we have the ability of a state audited the same way all of our 25 billion in reserves are audited. If you would go out and say, okay, Mr. Murphy, you could buy a Tether or a USDC or state of Wyoming, many people, we believe, would go to the Wyoming route to do this. The other aspect that I want to mention is not only can this coin be used to buy a taco or what have you, as Representative Olson mentioned, but one of the largest things that we see is transactions that we do every single day, billions and trillions of dollars. Right now, it takes 1 day to settle a US Treasury security. A check is 2 days. A corporate bond or an equity will take 2 days. By having this blockchain, this would enable instantaneous transactions. That's why this is so important. The timing of this would be extremely important, and you cannot do that now with the way that the US system is set up with fiat currency. So the reason that this is such a large opportunity is just the amount of money and the need to be able to do so. So I just wanted to say, what is the opportunity set? What would be the potential income generated to the state? And the last point is just on the bill. The Treasurer's Office would just like clarification of setting this up, how we would actually pay for this. So the way that I'm reading the Senator Office is that we would have this 102% cushion, which we talked about, but not until that is done, that the operational ability, the cost of hiring people and doing so would be paid for the treasurer. But is that correct in that it wouldn't? How would we pay for starting this business is a better question. Better way to phrase the question.
Answer for that, Senator Rothfuss, or should we delay that?
Mr. Chairman, the earnings were intended to provide payment, and that's the way it's the way the language says, but I was just contemplating the order of that. In the interest of time,
We'll get back to you. We'll get
yeah.
back to you on that, Mr.
We'll
Fleming.
work with you to make sure that language is correct so that you can use the revenue off of the issuance to provide for the administrative costs at any point instead of having to get to 102.
Thank you.
I think takes care of it.
Mr. Chairman, members.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'll double check that.
There being no more public comment, we'll close public comment. And committee, what's your pleasure?
Move the bill. About 106.
Senate File 106, been moved and seconded. Any discussion, any discussion? Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, the one thing, I'll look into the question that Patrick just asked and find a solution for it.
Okay. All right. Hearing no more questions, sensing the body's ready to vote, please do the roll call.
Senate File 106, Senator Beitman.
Excuse.
Senator Cooper voted absentee, yes. Senator Rothfuss.
Aye.
Senator Wasserberger.
Aye.
Chairman Anderson.
Aye. Senate File 106 has passed the Senate Minerals Committee and will go right through.
All right.
Anything else to come before the Senate Minerals Committee? We are going to make Roll call. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you
Thanks,
for your
everyone.
input. Thank you. We are adjourned. I don't know what to do about Bateman. I
I thought he
finally
was gonna leave
texted him
Lois.
and said, "Are you coming or not?" He said, "Well, I have a bill